Ethan stood in the center of the large conference hall on the starship Aurora Prime, his tall frame looming over most of the delegates. He was a creature used to attention, his dark, scaled skin glinting under the bright lights of the hall. Around him, beings from dozens of different worlds had gathered. There were tall, thin creatures with glowing eyes, short and squat ones covered in fur, and even a few with multiple limbs, each looking curiously at him. Yet none of them seemed quite like Ethan. "I've hunted Deathworlders no one else dares touch." Ethan's voice boomed across the hall. He spread his arms wide as if inviting the room to imagine his daring feats. "I've walked into jungles where the plants themselves could crush a man, and into deserts where the heat will melt the strongest armor. I've faced beasts that can tear a ship apart in seconds. And I came out alive every single time." The room responded immediately. Some delegates leaned forward, their eyes wide with amazement. Others whispered to one another, nodding and murmuring words that Ethan could not understand, but he guessed they meant praise. A few, however, looked skeptical, crossing their arms and raising their brows. Still, the majority of the room seemed ready to hang on his every word, and that was exactly what Ethan wanted. He took a slow step forward, letting his voice drop slightly, as if sharing a secret only for the most daring. "I have killed predators so large that an average warrior would run screaming. I have survived storms that would tear ships apart. And I have done it all alone, with nothing but my skill, my courage, and my instincts." A low murmur went through the room. Some delegates began to nod in approval. A few even clapped politely. Ethan smiled to himself. He could feel the admiration in the air and he enjoyed it immensely. He liked to see others impressed by his achievements. It made him feel bigger, stronger, smarter. Across the hall, a human woman named Lily sat quietly. She had short brown hair, sharp green eyes, and an expression that suggested she had heard far too many boasts in her life to be impressed by one more. She leaned back in her chair and watched Ethan with calm interest, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Unlike many of the delegates, she did not whisper to her neighbor or frown in doubt. She just watched, waiting. Ethan noticed her eventually. He paused mid-sentence and looked directly at her. "Ah, a human," he said, a smirk crossing his face. "You don't seem impressed. Do you not understand what I have accomplished?" Lily's lips curled into a small smile, but she did not speak. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and studied him as if considering whether he was worth her time. That small gesture, simple as it was, made Ethan's chest swell even more. He had attention. The fact that it came from a human, a species he had always considered physically weaker than his own, only made the moment sweeter. "I've faced monsters that would make your skin crawl," Ethan continued, his voice growing louder again. "Venomous, armored, fast, deadly. I've faced creatures that can breathe fire, that can swim faster than your fastest ship, that can hear and smell you before you even move. And still I stand here, alive, stronger than ever." He paused and let the words sink in. Around him the room was completely quiet. The aliens stared at him with wide eyes, imagining the creatures he had claimed to face. Ethan could see them picturing himself walking through swamps filled with carnivorous plants, deserts where the sun burned like molten metal, and mountains where the winds could tear a man apart. The more they imagined it, the more impressive he felt. Lily raised one eyebrow. She leaned forward slightly in her chair and whispered something under her breath, just loud enough for herself. "Let's see how far this goes." Ethan of course did not hear her. "Some have tried to challenge me," Ethan went on, a gleam in his eye. "Other hunters, other warriors, they have attempted to follow in my footsteps. They failed. Every one of them. And yet here I am, standing before you all. Untouched, unbroken, undefeated." He threw his arms wide again and let his voice echo across the hall. A few delegates clapped politely, clearly impressed. Others exchanged worried looks, perhaps realizing that if Ethan was right, no one in the room could match him. Lily continued to watch him quietly. She was not impressed by the noise, nor the exaggerated gestures. What caught her attention was his confidence. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself. It told a story of someone used to winning, someone used to being admired. But she also noticed a small detail. Every time he talked about surviving, he mentioned weapons, armor, and gadgets. Not once did he speak of skill without tools, strategy without support, or courage without protection. Ethan noticed her stare at him now and decided to make his final point. He stepped closer to the center of the hall, letting the silence of the room build. "I have survived where none other would dare set foot. I have conquered where others would fail. I am the greatest hunter of Deathworlders the galaxy has ever seen. Remember my name." With that, he spread his arms one last time, looking triumphant. The room erupted into applause, some polite, some excited. He could feel their admiration like a warm cloak around him. He had won. He had shown everyone that he was not only brave but unmatched, unstoppable, the best at what he did. And yet, across the hall, Lily continued to watch, unmoved. Her eyes were sharp, her posture calm, and her expression unreadable. There was a quiet power in her gaze, the kind of power that did not need noise or applause to be felt. She was not impressed by Ethan's stories, not yet. She had a question in her mind, one that would challenge everything he believed about himself. Ethan, of course, did not know it yet. He did not notice the faint smile that tugged at the corner of her lips. He did not see the spark of curiosity in her eyes. He assumed that his audience, this entire hall of delegates, was completely under his control. He assumed he was untouchable. But Lily had seen Deathworlders herself. She had survived conditions that would crush most beings without blinking. She knew something he did not, something simple and terrifying in its power. Humans did not need to boast, and humans did not need weapons to be dangerous. For now, Ethan basked in the glow of attention, the sound of applause, the murmurs of admiration. He had no idea that his greatest challenge was not waiting on some distant death world but sitting calmly across the room, waiting for the right moment to ask a single question. He laughed at a memory of a previous hunt, a giant predator on a volcanic world, and waved his hand to emphasize his story. It roared at me. Fire and smoke everywhere. I had only my armor and my blade. I knew it would kill me if I hesitated for even a moment. The delegates leaned in, imagining the scene. Some even shivered in fear. Ethan smiled. He loved that feeling. This was what it meant to be a hero, to be feared and respected at the same time. He had told enough stories to make the others feel small, unworthy, and impressed all at once. And yet, Lily leaned back, unshaken. She quietly counted the details in her mind. She noticed how often he mentioned armor, weapons, and tricks. She noted how his stories always relied on protection or tools. She understood something that no one else did, the truth of human power. Ethan's voice rose again. I faced storms, predators, and death itself. And I walked away. Remember that, all of you. I am the hunter you will never match. I am Ethan. The room erupted again in applause. Some clapped harder, others just nodded in awe. Ethan's chest swelled with pride. He had conquered their admiration completely. And across the hall, Lily just watched. She folded her hands and smiled faintly, knowing that admiration and noise were not the same as true respect. For now, the story had ended and Ethan was the center of attention. But she had seen enough. She knew that one question, simple and calm, could end the room. One question that would show that humans were not defined by weapons or technology, but by endurance, intelligence, and courage. Ethan laughed again, oblivious, thinking he had already proven himself. The room was full of whispers and awe, but Lily was thinking ahead, waiting for the perfect moment. For now, the hunter's boast was complete, but the real story had yet to begin. Lily's voice cut through the chatter like a quiet blade. Have you ever hunted one without weapons? The hall froze instantly. Ethan stopped mid-sentence, his mouth half open as if he had not expected anyone to speak. The murmurs that had filled the room moments before disappeared. Every eye in the hall turned toward him, including those of the other hunters, the merchants, and the alien delegates who had been listening in awe. A deep silence fell, heavier than any applause or whisper, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Ethan's smile faltered, just a little at first, then more noticeably. What do you mean?" he asked, trying to recover, but the words sounded weaker than he intended. His voice, usually so commanding, now carried a slight hesitation, a crack that had never been there before. "I mean exactly what I said," Lily said, her tone calm but sharp. Her green eyes held a quiet fire that made her question more than a challenge. It made it a statement. "How many Deathworlders have you hunted without weapons, without armor, without any of the gadgets and tools you rely on?" The room seemed to shrink around Ethan. He looked around, hoping that anyone would jump in to defend him or change the subject. But every face was watching him. Some were skeptical, others curious, and a few were quietly impressed with Lily's boldness. He felt their eyes like weights pressing down on him, and he realized he had never been questioned this way before. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to regain his confidence. I use tools because it is smart. It is wise. No warrior in the galaxy survives without preparation. His words were meant to sound strong, decisive, but in the hall they came off sounding defensive. Lily leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice low and calm. "I am asking about skill, courage, and endurance. Not tools. Not armor. Not weapons. Just you and the world you face. How many Deathworlders have you hunted that way? A few whispers started in the back of the hall. Some of the aliens tilted their heads, confused. Others looked intrigued. No one had asked a question like this before. Most were used to boasting, to seeing hunters like Ethan talk about their gadgets and strategies. But no one had ever asked what they could do without them. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to laugh it off, to make a joke, to say that of course no one hunted without weapons. But the laughter stuck in his throat. There was something about Lily's calm, unwavering gaze that made him doubt himself. Something about the way she sat quietly, her posture relaxed but her presence commanding, made him aware that this was not a game. I have always been prepared, he said, his voice a little louder, trying to reclaim authority. That is what makes me the greatest hunter. Preparation is survival. And preparation is not the same as courage, Lily said softly. Sometimes surviving is not about armor or weapons. Sometimes it is about your mind, your body, your instincts. Have you ever tried to survive on that alone? The room went completely quiet. Even the rustling of papers and the soft shifting of chairs seemed to vanish. Everyone present understood that this question was more than a challenge to Ethan. It was a challenge to every assumption they had about humans and hunters, about strength and survival. Ethan's claws clenched slightly, though he tried to hide it. He had always believed himself unbeatable, the best at what he did. He had faced fire-breathing beasts, giant predators, storms that could tear cities apart, and yet suddenly he felt small. Not physically small, but small in a way that went deeper than scales and strength. Lily's question cut to the heart of what made a hunter truly capable. He tried to recover. I rely on my skill and instincts too, he said, though even to his own ears, it sounded like an excuse. But survival without preparation? No one does that. It is foolish, dangerous, impossible. Lily's smile did not widen. She did not need to smile. Her calm presence was enough. She leaned back slightly, letting her words sink in. Impossible, she said, only if you think like everyone else. Humans have survived impossible worlds, on planets where heat melts metal, where storms rip the land apart, where predators hunt in packs too fast to see. And we do it often without weapons. We do it because we have to and because we can. The hall murmured again. Some delegates whispered to each other, tilting their heads. Others sat silently, listening with growing respect. Lily's words had shifted something in the room. They were beginning to understand that humans were not like other species. Humans were adaptable in ways that were hard to measure, hard to predict, and even harder to fight against. Ethan felt a prickling unease on his scales. He wanted to argue, to demonstrate his superiority, to list more feats. But as he looked around, he saw doubt in the eyes of some delegates. The whispers grew louder. Humans, it seemed, had quietly made a reputation that no amount of boasting could match. Do you think that makes us better than you? Lily asked softly, almost rhetorically. No. It just makes us different. And sometimes different is what survives. Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to challenge her, to say humans were lucky, or that their planets were tame compared to the death worlds he faced. But he found himself unable to speak. There was no argument that could erase the quiet truth in her words. Humans thrived in ways that relied on nothing but wit, endurance, and courage, and that was something he had never learned to respect fully. The other delegates were starting to notice too. They leaned forward, their expressions changing from curiosity to amazement. They began to see what Lily was saying. Humans survived conditions that would kill even their strongest warriors, not because of technology, but because of adaptability, creativity, and resilience. Ethan tried to regain control. I have conquered worlds, faced beasts no one else would touch, and survived. Surely that proves I am the greatest hunter. His roar echoed through the hall, but this time it did not have the same effect. The silence that followed was heavier, colder. People were listening, yes, but not in awe. They were questioning. Lily watched him carefully, her expression still calm. You have survived, she said. But surviving is different from thriving. Thriving is what humans do, even when everything is against us. Thriving does not need weapons. Thriving does not need gadgets. Thriving uses the mind, the body, and courage, alone. Some of the aliens in the room exchanged glances. A few nodded slightly, understanding the power behind her words. Others whispered among themselves, repeating the idea in their own languages. Even Ethan noticed the shift. He felt a strange weight pressing down on him, heavier than any predator, heavier than any storm he had faced. It was respect, quiet, undeniable, and directed toward Lily. He looked at her, searching for a weakness, any sign of exaggeration, but found none. She was calm, composed, and utterly sure of herself. Her question had done what no number of stories, feats, or demonstrations could do. It had made him doubt. Ethan's usual confidence wavered. He realized that this was not about weapons or tools but about something deeper. A skill, an endurance, a human way of surviving that he had never faced or understood. The room remained silent for a long moment. Some delegates looked at Ethan, some at Lily, and some at each other. Everyone understood that something had changed. The energy in the hall was no longer about his boasts. It was about the quiet, unspoken truth of human resilience. Finally, Ethan lowered his arms slightly. He could feel his pride shrinking under the weight of the question. It was a small, simple question, calm and almost casual, but it had dismantled all the power he thought he held. Lily leaned back, folding her arms gently. She did not speak again, but her gaze told the room everything they needed to know. Humans were not defined by weapons. Humans were not defined by technology. Humans were defined by endurance, intelligence, and courage, the very traits that made them capable of surviving impossible worlds. Ethan realized something else too. This question, simple and calm as it was, had done what no hunt, no weapon, no feat could do. It had humbled him. He had faced death on countless worlds, but he had never faced the quiet, unrelenting truth of human capability. The hall remained still. Some delegates slowly began to nod. Others whispered to each other, clearly impressed. The mood had shifted. Humans were no longer the underestimated species in the room. Humans were now something different, something more than he had ever imagined. Ethan opened his mouth to speak again but found no words. His stories, his boasts, all seemed small and insignificant in comparison to the quiet power Lily had just revealed. For the first time in his life he was truly aware of the strength of a human mind and body, unarmed, unprotected, relying only on instinct and courage. And in that moment the room understood too. They had been captivated by his boasting before, but now they were captivated by what they had not seen, what they had not considered. Humans were dangerous not because they were loud or armed, but because they survived. And that survival was something no boast, no weapon, no armor could ever truly measure. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew he had been outmatched not by strength but by simplicity. Lily had done what no one else could. One calm question had ended the room. Ethan stammered, unable to find the words. He had always relied on weapons, armor, and every gadget imaginable when hunting Deathworlders. To face one without any tools, relying only on skill, instinct, and courage, it was something he had never done, never even considered. The very thought made his chest tighten, and for the first time he felt a flicker of fear he could not mask with a boast. The hall was quiet. Even the whispers had stopped. The other hunters, who had been so confident and proud of their own accomplishments, now looked uneasy. They exchanged nervous glances, some shifting in their seats, some crossing their arms. A few muttered under their breath, questioning themselves and their own experience. If humans could survive unarmed against the most dangerous worlds, what did that make them? Dangerous, yes, and unpredictable. Humans were different, and that difference was becoming clear in every eye in the room. Ethan opened his mouth again, trying to regain control of the room, but his voice sounded smaller than before. I have faced Deathworlders that would kill anyone else, he said almost automatically, as if saying it enough times might make it true even now. And I have survived. That is proof of my skill. Proof that I am the greatest hunter alive. Lily did not flinch. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table in front of her, her eyes locked on him. Survival is not proof of skill, she said softly, if you only survive with weapons or armor. True skill is surviving without them. True skill is using your mind, your body, your courage. Humans have done that over and over, on worlds where no one else could survive even with all the tools you rely on. The words cut deeper than any weapon. Ethan felt a strange heat rise to his face, shame, frustration, perhaps even fear. He looked around the room and noticed the reactions of the other hunters. Some looked shocked. Some were frowning, clearly reconsidering their own accomplishments. Others were quietly impressed, their previous admiration for Ethan now mixed with curiosity and perhaps a little envy. Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything to regain control, but the sentences stuck in his throat. He had never faced a question that threatened his reputation like this. Never before had someone challenged him so directly, so calmly, and without insult. Lily was not yelling, not mocking, not attacking him. She was simply stating a truth that made all his bravado feel hollow. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. I rely on tools, he said, the words barely audible. That is what hunters do. That is how we survive. Lily shook her head slightly. That is how most species survive, she said. But humans are different. We survive even when there are no tools. Even when there is no armor. We survive when the world seems impossible. That is why we are dangerous. That is why you should never underestimate us. Ethan felt a cold sweat run down his spine. He had faced storms that ripped trees from the ground, beasts with claws sharp enough to slice through steel, predators that could hear a heartbeat from miles away, and yet the calm confidence of this one human made him feel exposed, unprepared, and unworthy of the title he had claimed so proudly. The other hunters in the room began to shift uncomfortably. They looked at each other with worried expressions. A few low murmurs started, growing as they began to speak quietly among themselves. If humans could survive unarmed on worlds no one else could, what did that mean for them? Were they still the best? Were their achievements really as impressive as they thought? Ethan tried again, this time with more force, hoping to reclaim the attention of the room. I have faced monsters that would kill hundreds in moments. I have walked through rivers of lava, climbed mountains where the wind would tear a man apart, and I have survived. His voice was loud, booming, but something had changed. He could feel the uncertainty creeping in. Even his words sounded hollow to him. Lily remained calm. She did not need to shout to hold the room's attention. She simply looked at him, her expression steady, her green eyes unwavering. "And you survived because of your weapons," she said softly. "Humans survive because of themselves. No tools, no protection, just instinct, courage, and adaptability. That is something no beast, no storm, and no world can take away. That is why humans are feared. That is why humans endure where others fail." The whispers grew louder. Some of the delegates began nodding slightly. Others tilted their heads, clearly impressed and perhaps a little uneasy. The weight of Lily's words settled over the room like a heavy fog. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was undeniable. Humans were not weak, not helpless, not ordinary. They were dangerous in ways that Ethan had never considered. Ethan's pride wavered. He had spent his life believing that skill came from strength, from weapons, from preparation. And now he realized that true skill could exist without any of those things. Humans had survived worlds that would destroy even the strongest of hunters. And they had done it without the gadgets, without the armor, without the weapons that he relied on so heavily. He looked at Lily and saw nothing but calm certainty. She was not exaggerating, not boasting, not challenging him for the sake of argument. She was simply stating a truth that he could not ignore. And the room, silent but attentive, seemed to recognize it as well. The other hunters shifted again, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. They were reconsidering what they thought they knew. Humans, it seemed, were not to be underestimated. Not for their size, not for their strength, and certainly not for their reliance on tools. Their danger lay in their unpredictability, their intelligence, and their endurance. Ethan's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. He wanted to argue, to laugh, to dismiss Lily's words, but nothing came. For the first time he felt small in a way he had never experienced. Not physically, not in battle, but in the face of raw, calm confidence that came without noise, without weapons, without fanfare. Lily leaned back slightly, letting her gaze sweep across the room. She did not need to speak again. Her presence was enough. The other delegates began to murmur softly, their conversations hushed but full of awe. Humans were not just survivors, they were a species that thrived where others could not. Humans were capable of courage that did not rely on tools. Humans were dangerous in a way that no one had really considered before. Ethan finally lowered his arms, realizing he had lost the room. He had come to command attention, to dominate the hall with his stories, but instead he felt exposed. He had been outshone, not by strength, but by something much simpler and more powerful: the quiet, unwavering truth of human ability. The other hunters were no longer focused on his stories. Some were frowning, some nodding slowly, and some whispering excitedly. They were beginning to understand what Lily had shown them with just a few words and calm confidence. Humans were extraordinary. Humans did not need to boast. Humans survived and thrived where others failed. Lily smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips that carried more power than any shout could have. She did not need to raise her voice or make dramatic gestures. Her calm, quiet confidence filled the room, drawing every eye toward her. The delegates leaned forward slightly in their chairs, curiosity and tension mingling in the air. Even Ethan, who had spent his life boasting and intimidating others, felt the weight of her words before she spoke them. "Humans survive deserts," she began, her voice steady and clear, "frozen wastes and toxic swamps." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. Some of the delegates whispered to each other, eyes widening. A few furrowed their brows, trying to picture what she meant. Deserts where the heat could melt metal, frozen lands that would crack the strongest bones, swamps where poison in the air could kill in minutes. These were places where most species could not even survive an hour. Yet humans endured, and she was saying that without exaggeration. Ethan shifted in his seat, feeling an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. He had always believed that survival depended on weapons, on armor, on preparation. That was what had allowed him to face Deathworlders and monstrous beasts, or so he thought. And yet, here was a human woman, calm and composed, talking about surviving with nothing but courage and intelligence. No gadgets, no tools, no artificial advantage. Just humans and their will to endure. We adapt, improvise and endure where others fail, Lily continued. Her words were simple, but they carried weight, heavy and undeniable. She did not raise her voice, she did not gesture dramatically, yet each word hit the room like a strike of truth. Some of the delegates leaned closer to hear better, some tilted their heads, imagining the world she described. They began to realize that humans were not ordinary. Humans were unpredictable, clever, and resilient in ways no one else had considered. The hall remained quiet for a few moments, filled only with the faint hum of the starship's engines and the soft whispers of astonished delegates. The room was no longer laughing at Ethan's boasts or nodding politely. They were beginning to murmur in awe, slowly realizing the truth of what Lily was saying. Humans survived where no other species could, thrived where others perished, and endured when even the strongest warriors failed. Ethan could feel the shift. His stories of daring hunts and death-world victories, which had once filled the room with admiration, now sounded hollow. Every tale he had told about monsters, storms, and impossible worlds seemed smaller, weaker, in comparison to the quiet truth that Lily was revealing. Humans did not need to hunt for glory to prove themselves. Their survival was proof enough. Some of the alien hunters shifted in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. They had always prided themselves on their strength, their skill, their tools and weapons. They had believed they were the ultimate survivors, able to conquer death worlds with technology and brute force. And now they were beginning to see that humans could survive those same worlds with little more than courage, intelligence, and adaptability. Ethan's claws dug slightly into the armrests of his chair. He could feel the heat of embarrassment and frustration rising in him. He wanted to speak, to argue, to prove that his experience and skill were still superior. But Lily's calm confidence was a wall he could not breach. Every attempt to interrupt her or assert himself felt smaller than the last. He realized that no weapon, no gadget, no dramatic story could compete with what she had just said. Lily continued, her voice soft but compelling. Humans do not rely on strength alone. We do not rely on weapons, tools, or armor to survive. We rely on our minds, our instincts, and our will. That is why we endure when other species fail. That is why we can survive worlds that others consider impossible. The murmurs in the room grew. Delegates leaned forward in their seats, whispering to each other, trying to understand. Some of them even looked at Ethan, who was sitting tensely, his face showing the first cracks of doubt. The realization was spreading. Humans were dangerous not because they boasted, not because they had weapons, not because they relied on tools. They were dangerous because they adapted, improvised, and endured when others could not. Ethan tried to respond. I have survived death worlds no one else could, he said, his voice firm but lacking its usual confidence. I have faced monsters that could crush ships. I have faced storms that tear the strongest armor apart. Surely that proves my skill. Lily shook her head, unfazed. Surviving with weapons is one thing. Surviving without them is another. Humans endure when everything is against us, with nothing but our minds, bodies, and courage. That is skill. That is power. That is why humans cannot be underestimated. The room seemed to pause again. The weight of her words settled over the delegates, heavier than any roar or boast. For the first time they were not listening to Ethan, they were listening to the quiet power of humanity. Some nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth. Some whispered in disbelief, trying to reconcile their previous assumptions with this new reality. Others looked thoughtful, realizing that perhaps humans had always been underestimated. Even the youngest delegates, who had never faced a Deathworlder or left their home planets, could sense the difference. Humans were not like other species. They survived where others could not. They endured when others fell. They adapted when others were trapped. And they did it without reliance on weapons or tools, which made them unpredictable, clever, and dangerous in ways the other species had not considered. Ethan's pride faltered. He looked around the room, seeing the whispers and the nods, feeling the slow shift in attention and respect. For the first time he realized that his stories, while impressive, were not as powerful as the simple truth of human survival. No monster, no storm, no technology could match the quiet, unstoppable determination that humans carried with them everywhere. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words stuck in his throat. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with a strange awareness. Humans were more capable than he had ever imagined, and his pride could not change that. He had spent his life relying on tools, weapons, and strength, while humans relied on something much simpler and much more effective: adaptability, courage, and intelligence. Lily leaned back slightly, folding her arms with a calm that made the room shift again. She did not need to shout or make dramatic gestures. Her quiet confidence was enough to hold the attention of every delegate in the hall. The whispers continued, growing slightly louder as everyone began to realize the same thing: humans were extraordinary. Some of the older hunters in the room exchanged looks of disbelief. They had fought monsters, braved storms, and faced challenges that would have killed most species. And yet, Lily's words reminded them that humans could survive even harsher conditions, often without the support of weapons, armor, or technology. The room was slowly coming to terms with the quiet truth: humans were dangerous in ways that could not be measured by feats of strength alone. Ethan could feel his chest tighten. He wanted to argue, to reclaim control, but the truth of Lily's words was undeniable. Humans did not need to boast because survival itself was proof. Humans did not need weapons because endurance, intelligence, and courage were enough. Humans did not need to fight to be respected. They simply survived, adapted, and endured where others could not. The murmurs in the room grew, spreading like wildfire. Delegates whispered to each other, some nodding slowly, some exchanging looks of admiration or concern. Ethan realized that he had lost the attention of the hall. His stories, his boasts, his claims of greatness were now background noise. The real focus was human capability, calm and undeniable, embodied in Lily's words and presence. Lily's gaze swept the room slowly, quietly acknowledging the shift she had created. She did not need to speak again. The truth was clear: humans survived the impossible. Humans endured where others failed. Humans adapted when other species could not. And humans, it seemed, could not be underestimated. Ethan lowered his arms, feeling the pride he had relied on for so long slipping away. He had faced Deathworlders, storms, and monsters, but he had never faced the quiet power of human endurance. For the first time, he understood that survival was not just about weapons or tools. It was about courage, adaptability, and intelligence. The room remained quiet, filled with whispers and awe. Humans were not just another species, they were something different, something unpredictable, something extraordinary. The delegates were beginning to understand what Lily had known all along. Humans were dangerous not because they boasted or carried weapons, but because they could survive and thrive where others could not. Ethan swallowed hard, humbled for the first time. He had boasted and claimed superiority, but now he realized that humans were not to be underestimated. They survived deserts that could burn ships, frozen wastes that could snap bones, and toxic swamps that could poison the strongest beings. They endured, adapted, and improvised when others failed. The room began to murmur again, but this time the tone had changed. The sound was no longer admiration for Ethan's stories. It was awe, respect, and a growing understanding of the quiet, relentless power of humanity. Lily's faint smile remained, calm and confident, as she let the truth speak for itself. Humans did not need to boast, did not need weapons, and did not need fanfare. Their survival, their endurance, and their adaptability were proof enough of their extraordinary nature. Even Ethan, once the loudest voice in the hall, could not argue with that. He had been humbled, not by strength or skill, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of human capability. And in that moment, the room began to see humans not as ordinary, but as something exceptional, something to respect, something to fear. Ethan's confidence wavered. He had always stood tall in every hall, every arena, every hunting ground, knowing that he was unmatched. He had faced monsters that could rip ships apart, storms that could destroy entire cities, and predators faster and stronger than anything most species had ever imagined. And yet, here he was, in the middle of a crowded conference hall, feeling uncertain for the first time in his life. He shifted in his seat, trying to mask the unease that was crawling up his spine. His claws tapped nervously against the armrest, a subtle movement that he hoped no one would notice. But the room was silent now in a different way. Every eye was on him, not with admiration, not with fear, but with curiosity and respect that was starting to shift into something heavier. Ethan felt the weight of it pressing down on him, and it was uncomfortable in a way that no predator or storm had ever managed to make him feel. The alien delegates began to look at humans differently. For the first time, They were not seeing a species that was quiet, harmless, or easy to underestimate. They were seeing a species that had survived worlds and conditions that would have killed most of the galaxy's strongest hunters. They were seeing courage, intelligence, endurance, and adaptability all combined into one species that did not boast, did not threaten, and did not rely on tools or weapons to prove itself. Ethan's mind raced. He had spent his entire life believing that strength, skill, and preparation were what defined a hunter. That belief had carried him across death worlds, had allowed him to face creatures that others would run from, had given him the confidence to boast in front of crowds and command respect. And now, in a few quiet words, Lily had dismantled all of that. She had reminded everyone that humans did not rely on those things to survive. Humans relied on something stronger, something simpler, and something that could not be measured by weapons or feats alone. He tried to speak, to regain his usual commanding tone. "I have faced Deathworlders no one else would touch," he said, forcing his voice to sound loud and confident. "I have walked where others would die. I have killed beasts that could crush cities." But Lily's calm, steady gaze cut through his words. She did not flinch, she did not raise her voice, and she did not need to interrupt. She simply looked at him, relaxed and composed, and the room felt her authority. The delegates were no longer listening to Ethan's stories. They were listening to the quiet power of human endurance, the calm knowledge that humans had survived impossible worlds over and over again. Lily leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. Her hands were folded neatly, and she spoke softly but clearly. "Humans survive because we adapt, we improvise, and we endure. Not because of weapons, not because of armor, and not because of technology. We endure because we must and because we can. That is why humans are dangerous and why you should never underestimate us." The room stirred. A few delegates whispered to each other, nodding slowly. Others leaned back, tilting their heads as they thought through what Lily had said. Even the younger hunters, who had never left their home planets, could understand the weight of her words. Humans were not just survivors. Humans were capable of facing conditions and creatures that others could not, and they did it using nothing but themselves. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had always believed that he was unmatched, that he had faced the impossible and conquered it. But now, he realized that humans did not need to face the impossible in the same way. They did not need weapons or armor. They did not need gadgets or strategies. They survived, adapted, and endured in ways that no one else could even imagine. And that made them dangerous, perhaps even more dangerous than he had ever been. He tried again to speak, but his words sounded hollow. I have conquered death worlds, survived storms, and defeated predators." Lily shook her head slightly, her expression calm but firm. "Yes, you have survived, and that is impressive. But surviving with weapons is one thing. Surviving without them, facing the same dangers with only your mind and body, that is something humans do every day. That is why we endure. That is why we survive where others fail." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Delegates whispered to each other, some nodding, some frowning in disbelief. Ethan's previous stories, which had once commanded the room's attention, now seemed small and unimpressive. The quiet truth of human endurance was filling the space instead. The whispers were not about his strength. They were about humans, and the respect was shifting rapidly. Ethan felt his pride faltering. He had spent his entire life relying on tools, skill, and preparation. But here, in a quiet hall filled with aliens from dozens of worlds, he was realizing that humans had something stronger than any of those things. They had intelligence, courage, and adaptability, traits that could not be measured by weapons or feats of strength. Traits that could make them survive worlds where even the bravest hunters might die. Lily's calm presence reminded everyone of this truth. She did not boast. She did not raise her voice. She simply let the facts speak for themselves. Humans had survived deserts where the sun burned like molten metal. Humans had endured frozen wastelands that could shatter bones. Humans had thrived in swamps that poisoned the air and water. They had done it repeatedly, without weapons, without armor, without anything except themselves. The alien delegates exchanged glances, realizing something that had been hidden to them until now. Humans were not just another species to be watched. Humans were clever, adaptable, and dangerous in ways that could not be easily predicted. They had survived when others would fail. And that made them something different. Something to respect. Something to fear. Ethan swallowed hard. He tried to remind himself of all the feats he had accomplished, all the hunts he had survived. But in the quiet hall, filled with whispers and astonished glances, he realized that none of it mattered as much as he had thought. His weapons, his armor, his stories, they were impressive, yes, but they were only one kind of survival. Humans represented a different kind of survival, one that relied on intelligence, courage, and endurance alone. He looked at Lily again, and for the first time he felt respect, not for her personally but for what she represented. She embodied the quiet strength of humanity, the ability to endure, adapt, and survive where others could not. And she did it without boasting, without demanding attention, without relying on tools. She let her actions, and the facts of human survival, speak for themselves. The room was alive with quiet realization. Whispers turned to soft murmurs of approval, nods, and thoughtful expressions. Some of the alien delegates looked at Ethan, reconsidering everything they had thought about hunters, strength, and survival. Humans were different, yes, but that difference was powerful. Humans were not just another species. They were extraordinary. Ethan felt a strange mix of pride and humility. He had faced Deathworlders, he had survived impossible conditions, he had boasted and commanded respect for years. But now, in the quiet presence of one human and the subtle awe of the room, he realized that survival without tools, without weapons, without gadgets, that was something he could not claim. That was something humans had mastered, and it humbled him in a way that no predator, storm, or monstrous beast ever had. Lily leaned back, her faint smile unchanging. She did not need to shout or gesture. The room had already understood the truth. Humans survived, endured, and adapted in ways that no one else could. Their power was quiet, unstoppable, and undeniable. Even the other hunters, the ones who had once felt superior, were beginning to realize that humans were not to be underestimated. They were clever, resourceful, and capable of enduring impossible odds. Their strength was not in weapons or brute force, it was in intelligence, courage, and adaptability. Ethan finally lowered his head slightly, the first hint of humility in his posture. He understood now that human survival was something to be respected, not challenged. The room had shifted, slowly but completely. Humans had gone from being overlooked to being recognized as extraordinary. The whispers continued, soft and full of awe. The aliens were beginning to understand that humans were different, in a way that made them powerful and dangerous. They were not the strongest or the fastest, but they were the most adaptable. They survived when others failed, endured when others fell, and thrived when the world seemed impossible. Ethan's chest tightened. He realized that this quiet recognition, this respect, was more powerful than any applause, any roar, any story he had ever told. Humans did not need to boast, they survived. Humans did not need weapons, they endured. Humans did not need to fight, they adapted. And the room slowly began to see it too. The hall remained quiet, the kind of quiet that was heavier than silence itself. It was not the tense hush that came before an announcement, nor the polite pause that followed applause. It was a quiet filled with understanding, with realization, with a truth that had settled in the hearts and minds of everyone present. Every delegate, every hunter, every alien creature in the room had just witnessed something remarkable. They had watched a human stand before them, calm and composed, and reveal the undeniable power of survival, endurance, and intelligence. Ethan sat in his seat, still tall and imposing, but the confidence that had carried him through countless Deathworld hunts seemed smaller now, almost fragile. He had boasted of feats, of victories over monsters that could tear ships apart, of storms that would kill armies, and of survival against odds that no one else dared to face. And yet, here in this hall, he had realized that all of that, though impressive, did not compare to the quiet, unshakable capability of humans. He had faced predators and storms, but he had never faced the truth that humans could endure, adapt, and survive without weapons, without armor, without preparation. The other delegates looked around the room, their whispers growing softer as realization spread. Some leaned forward slightly in their chairs, trying to comprehend what Lily had revealed. Others tilted their heads, their eyes wide, as if they were seeing humans for the first time. There was a subtle shift in the way they looked at humanity, no longer dismissive, no longer polite, no longer merely curious. They looked with respect, with awe, and even with a hint of fear. Humans were not just another species in the galaxy. Humans were extraordinary. Lily remained standing, calm and poised, her eyes sweeping the room as if measuring the impact of her words. She did not need to boast or shout. Her presence alone carried authority. She had not raised her voice, she had not shouted victories, she had not displayed weapons or artifacts. All she had done was speak plainly, clearly, and truthfully about what humans could do. And that was enough. Her quiet strength, her composure, and the simple honesty of her statements had shifted the entire mood of the room. Delegates exchanged glances, murmuring softly to each other. Some of the younger hunters looked at Ethan with new eyes, realizing that his reputation, built on weapons, skill, and bravado, was no longer absolute. Humans had shown a type of power that could not be measured by feats of strength, size, or technology. They survived where others failed, endured where others would perish, and adapted when other species would have no hope. And they did it without fanfare, without boasting, without tools. Ethan felt the full weight of this realization. For the first time in his life, he could not find a way to claim superiority over humans. He had faced Deathworlders but always with weapons. He had survived storms but always prepared. He had confronted monsters but always with the advantage of armor or tools. And now he understood that true survival, the kind that humans mastered, required none of those things. Humans relied on courage, intelligence, instinct, and endurance. And in that reliance they were unstoppable. The room seemed to breathe as one. Every whisper, every glance, every tilt of the head carried the understanding that humans had just revealed something that could not be ignored. They had survived deserts that could burn metal, frozen wastelands that could shatter bones, and toxic swamps that could poison the strongest beings. They had endured, adapted, and thrived in conditions that would have killed even the most experienced hunters. And they had done it without weapons, without armor, without tools. The hall had witnessed a shift. What had started as a gathering to celebrate hunters and their achievements had transformed into a silent acknowledgement of human capability. Delegates looked at each other with a new understanding, realizing that humans were not just survivors. They were extraordinary in ways that could not be measured by physical strength, technological advantage, or flashy feats. Humans were clever, adaptable, resilient, and unyielding. They were dangerous in a way that could not be predicted or contained. Ethan's eyes met Lily's. He saw the calm certainty in her gaze, and for the first time he felt a deep respect, not for her personally but for the species she represented. He had always believed that survival meant weapons, preparation, and strength. Now he understood that survival could mean something much simpler, yet much more powerful: the ability to endure, to adapt, to think, and to persevere when the odds were impossible. And humans had mastered that skill. The other hunters and delegates continued to murmur softly, acknowledging the truth in their own way. Some nodded slowly, their expressions thoughtful. Others whispered in their native languages, translating the concept to one another. The awe was subtle but undeniable. Humans had quietly shown what it meant to be extraordinary. They had survived the impossible, endured the unbearable, and thrived where others would fail. And they had done it without raising a weapon or a shout. Ethan shifted in his seat again, this time more slowly, more carefully. He realized that he had been outmatched, not by strength, not by numbers, not by tools, but by resilience, intelligence, and courage. He had faced predators that could destroy planets, but humans had faced worlds where survival seemed impossible, and they had survived. That simple fact humbled him. It made him reconsider everything he had believed about power, strength, and capability. Lily's calm presence dominated the room without effort. She did not need to point out Ethan's pride or diminish his accomplishments. The quiet truth of what she had said was enough. Humans survived the unthinkable. Humans endured the impossible. Humans adapted where all others failed. That quiet strength, that simple truth, carried more weight than any boast or story. Delegates continued to murmur softly, some exchanging looks of awe, others turning thoughtful, their expressions serious. Humans had made themselves known in a way that no amount of boasting could achieve. They did not need weapons to impress. They did not need to fight to dominate. They did not need armor to survive. Their presence, their resilience, and their ability to endure made them extraordinary. Even the smallest delegates, who had never faced danger beyond their homeworlds, could sense it. Humans were different. Humans were dangerous. Humans were remarkable. And that truth was settling over the room like a wave, quiet but unstoppable. Ethan finally lowered his head slightly, the first true sign of humility he had shown in the hall. He had been the loudest, the proudest, the most boastful, but now he understood that true power did not come from stories, weapons, or feats. True power came from enduring the impossible, surviving the unimaginable, and rising above when others fell. And humans had shown that power in full view of the galaxy's greatest hunters. Lily's faint smile remained, calm and steady. She did not need to speak further. The room had already absorbed the lesson. Humans did not need to boast because their survival was proof enough. Humans did not need weapons because their intelligence and endurance were their true strength. Humans did not need fanfare because their extraordinary nature was clear to anyone willing to see it. The whispers continued softly, but now they were filled with respect. Delegates exchanged nods, acknowledging the quiet truth. Humans were extraordinary. They survived where others would die. They endured when others would fail. They adapted when the galaxy had written them off. And all of this they did without raising a weapon, without shouting, without demanding attention. Ethan looked around the room one last time. He saw admiration in some eyes, respect in others, and even a faint trace of fear in a few. He understood now that the galaxy had underestimated humans for too long. He had relied on strength, tools, and preparation, but humans relied on something much simpler: courage, endurance, and intelligence. And that made them unstoppable in a way that no boasting or weapon could ever match. The hall remained quiet, the lesson complete and undeniable. Every delegate, every hunter, every alien present had understood it. Humans did not need weapons to impress. Humans did not need to fight to dominate. Humans did not need tools to survive. They endured, adapted, and thrived, and in doing so they became extraordinary. And in that moment the galaxy had seen the truth. Humans were remarkable. Humans were dangerous. Humans were extraordinary. And nothing in the room could ever make anyone forget it,